Public hearings were held today in front of the Committee on Environment and Natural Resources for private residences to increase a seawall to protect their property. The bill proposed by Representative Robert Foley of Wells would allow those to apply for a permit to raise a seawall in a coastal sand dune system by up to 2 feet. The goal is to protect against storm damage and rising sea levels in coastal communities. Supporters, some who own property at Camp Ellis, claim that the bill would help protect their houses and businesses from further sea damage, while those opposing say that it's a short-term solution that could harm the environment and neighboring properties.
While seawalls and other hardened structures may offer some localized protection for individual properties, they can accelerate erosion elsewhere, as you've heard, literally shifting the burden to somebody else. Permitting property owners to elevate seawalls by 2 feet or reinforce their land with riprap and protected natural areas does not resolve the challenges of sea level rise, and instead it temporarily benefits those who can afford such measures while worsening erosion and damaging neighboring properties and further harming Maine beaches and marshes.
Last year I had docks, boats floating through my yard, banging into my house, and I couldn't, it's quite unnerving when you see that.
Those in the committee requested Foley to work with the Bureau of Land Resources in amending the bill ahead of the work session, which has not yet been scheduled.